You want to come by and see? Hello. Welcome to our Tuesday night program. I'm Lynn Young, Chair of the Life Enrichment Committee. I invited David Zucchino to speak to us about his book after he spoke to my book club via Zoom in January. I'm delighted that he could join us tonight. Jim Savara, my park home neighbor, kindly agreed to be the moderator for this program. Jim was a faculty member in political science and public administration, starting with his first appointment at UNC Greensboro in 1972. He later taught at NC State and Arizona State University before retiring and returning to North Carolina in 2012. The focus of his teaching and research has been on local government policy and administration. Jim co-edited a book on social equity in 2011 titled Justice for All. And you will be able, for those that are watching this on 1390, you will be able to call in your questions and we'll get them presented. So it's extension 2424. Thanks.
Lynn, thank you very much, and welcome to everybody who's here and all of those of you who are watching from home. We are so pleased to have David Zucchino with us tonight. He received a degree in journalism from UNC Chapel Hill in 1973, and he's been inducted at the North Carolina Media and Journalism Hall of Fame. He has been a foreign correspondent for the Philadelphia Inquirer and the Los Angeles Times. He has covered wars and civil conflicts in more than 36 countries. He won a Pulitzer Prize in 1989 for a series titled Being Black in South Africa and is a 4-time Pulitzer finalist. He is now a contributing writer for the New York Times. He published last year the book Wilmington's Lie, The Murderous Coup of 1898 and the Rise of White Supremacy. We are, again, so pleased to have him share that marvelous book with us. What we're going to do tonight is that I will ask questions about the book to guide the presentation. And we will invite questions from the audience at 2 points in our discussion. We'll open it up for questions when we finish talking about the coup itself and the events that led up to it. And then we'll talk more about longer-term impacts and consequences, comparisons over time, and then what led to developing and sharing with the world the full story about what happened in Wilmington. So think about the questions that you have, and you will be able to share them. We'll bring a microphone around. If you're at home, you can call in questions at 2424, and they will be shared. With David Zucchino. Just to get us started, I was curious, David, asking you about why you wrote this book. I mean, you were a foreign correspondent, and yet we know that you also wrote another book that looked at an important domestic issue, the myth of welfare queens, and also exposed that as being untrue. Well, so what prompted you to take on this very large project that you took on to explore the Wilmington events?
Well, first of all, can everybody hear me okay? All right. Thank you for having me here. And I do want to apologize up front. I just got back late last night from a month in Afghanistan, and so I'm totally jet-lagged. If I struggle for words, Jim's going to take over and finish for me. But in answer to the question is, what got me interested in this, I went to high school and college in North Carolina, and not once in any history class did any professor or any book mention Wilmington 1898. I had never heard of it. The whole time I was at UNC, I passed names of people who were involved in the coup, and there were some 30 buildings on campus. I found out much later that were named after participants in the coup, starting with Kenan Stadium and starting with the dormitory I lived in, Morrison Dormitory. Morrison was one of the perpetrators of the coup. I did not find out about what happened in Wilmington in 1898 until 1998, when I started reading newspaper stories about the commemoration of the 100th year anniversary of the coup. And I was fascinated, and then two things really struck me was, one, how could I not know about an event that was this important? And secondly, how could it happen in the United States of America? I was just stunned. So I decided then that I really wanted to look into it, but as Jim mentioned, I was a foreign correspondent, have been a foreign correspondent for 45 years, and just never had the time up until a few years ago when I took a leave from my job and spent about 3 years digging into it. I've written 2 other books where I witnessed the events that took place in the book and talked to people, and obviously with this book, they're all dead, everybody who took part in this. Every single piece of information in this book came from a document, from a piece of paper somewhere, so it took quite a while to research the book and dig into the history with various letters and newspaper stories and memoirs, diaries, and things like that.
Okay, very good. Well, I wonder if we could start by describing the context in which these events were going to occur. What was North Carolina like after the Civil War, in the Reconstruction period, post-Reconstruction? And then we'll ask the same thing about Wilmington itself.
Right. The thing you have to remember about North Carolina, and in fact the entire South, right after the Civil War, is that immediately white supremacists set about trying to regain the power and control they had over black Americans, and specifically they were determined to keep black men from voting because they realized if black men had to vote, in certain areas of North Carolina, like the 18 counties in the east, known as the Black Belt, if black men were allowed to vote there would be 18 counties where whites would not be able to be in office. Particularly Wilmington, which was 56% black. They realized if black men had the vote there, they would be outvoted. So immediately after Wilmington fell, at the end of the Civil War, and by the way, Wilmington for the last year of the Civil War kept the South alive. It was the only functioning port the Confederacy had left for the last year. And all the war material, ammunition, supplies, and weapons came up through Wilmington. And when Wilmington fell after the Battle of Fort Fisher in the winter of 1865, the war was essentially over. But even with U.S. troops in charge, supposedly, in Wilmington, they realized that they needed somebody to get the city functioning again, to get things up and running after the chaos of the war. The first thing the generals in charge of the Union did was reappoint the white supremacist mayor who had run Wilmington prior to the war. And this mayor appointed a recently former Confederate colonel as police chief, and this police chief hired former Confederate soldiers as police officers. And I just want to read a description of really what was happening, and this was immediately after the war. These police officers received no training as policemen, but they brought to the job their military skills and their contempt for black men. They preyed on freed slaves, whipping the men in public and beating the women with boards. In the countryside, former Confederate soldiers banded with white residents to form county militia companies that rampaged through the area, terrorizing black families in their homes. W.H.H. Beale, a Union lieutenant colonel stationed in Wilmington, was appalled by the attacks. Colonel Beale had been installed as a local officer of the Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress in March of 1865 to advance the rights and living conditions of freed slaves. Colonel Beale was appalled at what he saw. Quote, here's from his report to Congress: "The policemen are the hardest and most brutal-looking and acting sort of civil or municipal officers I ever saw. All look bad and vicious. Physical abuse of freed blacks by white police officers and citizens was rampant, on and off the plantations. Plantation squatters were evicted by force. Police seized guns owned by black men. They searched their homes and seized their belongings. In the summer of 1865, an officer in the Freedmen's Bureau in Wilmington maintained a ledger of complaints of whippings and beatings filed by former slaves. I'll read a couple examples. By colored man Dick, that J.W. whipped him severely, striking him 72 blows. by colored woman Martha that J.F. Parker overtook her while on her way to the office of the superintendent of freedmen, put one end of rope around her neck, tied the other around the neck of his mule, and so dragged her for more than 2 miles. And one other example, by colored man Levi that WFL, a white man, has whipped him severely with a buggy trace, shows his back all raw. The point here is that immediately white supremacists set about trying to return freed black slaves, who had only been freed for a few months, back to conditions very much approaching slavery. And one important way they did this were through so-called black codes that were passed throughout the South, but in North Carolina in 1866, 2 years even before black men got to vote. And these codes basically restricted the right of black men to work. Black men could not serve on juries. They certainly could not marry white women. They couldn't send their kids to, quote, white schools. And black children could be forcibly lent out for unpaid labor on the plantations. And finally, it very much restricted where and how black men could work. And it passed vagrancy laws, which allowed the white police to sweep up any black men they found on the street, charge them with vagrancy, put them in jail, and then lease them out to the plantation owners to work for free labor, basically as slaves.
So the conditions in Wilmington would change, though, over time. I was surprised to read that Wilmington was the largest city in North Carolina at that point, and you've said that it was 56% black. With the federal amendments, what changed? How did things evolve over the next couple decades?
Right. By the 1890s, which was 30 years after the Civil War, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments had been passed, making black men citizens and giving them the right to vote, supposedly, but these amendments were not honored throughout the South. They were ignored. But even so, by the mid-1890s, freed black men and their descendants had been drawn to Wilmington, which, as Jim mentioned, was the biggest city in North Carolina and the most important city. There were jobs in the naval stores industry, which was pine, turpentine, and pitch. There were many, many jobs at the port of Wilmington, which was one of the biggest ports in the United States. It was a railroad terminus. All these conditions brought black men and their families to work, and a black middle class evolved, and even a black professional class of more than 60 men who were doctors, lawyers, teachers, and ministers. By 1898, there were 3 of the 10 city aldermen in Wilmington were black men, and 10 of the 26 policemen were black men, and this came about as a result of what was known as fusion. Poor white farmers who had previously supported the Democratic Party, which at this time was the party of white supremacy, and the Republican Party was the party of Lincoln and black suffrage. These poor white farmers had become disillusioned with the Democratic Party. They felt that it had been taken over by the banks and the railroads and big money interests, and wasn't watching out for their interests as farmers. They migrated to the Republican Party, which meant that they aligned themselves with black voters. And this coalition took over the state legislature in 1896 and took over Wilmington's government in 1897. And the white supremacists, who all through Reconstruction and beyond had controlled Wilmington and the state, the so-called redeemers, they had redeemed the South for white supremacy, weren't going to stand for this, and they were determined to destroy black suffrage forever and make sure that black men were not elected to office or appointed to office ever again. I mean, you had conditions where you had black magistrates who presided over trials of white men. You had the black police officers who could arrest white men even though they were ordered not to by the white police chief. Again, you had this thriving middle class and this professional class, and this was a real threat to the white supremacists, in large part because, as we mentioned before, the city was 56% black. The whites had a two-pronged campaign. One was violence and intimidation. They had so-called red shirts, which was an outgrowth of the KKK, and these were essentially vigilantes whose job it was in the summer and fall of 1898, which, by the way, was an election year, was to ride out into the Cape Fear countryside at night, break into black homes, pull out black men, and beat them and whip them and tell them, if you dare register to vote, we'll come back and kill you. And throughout this summer, prior to the election in November, they completely intimidated black men and really drove down the vote. They also, the white supremacist leaders in Wilmington, had two militias, the Wilmington Light Infantry and the Naval Reserves. Now, these were supposedly like today's National Guard. They were supposed to report to the Republican governor in Raleigh, but in fact, they were made up entirely of white supremacists and commanded by white supremacists who were the very men who were plotting the coup. And they were very open about it and announced all summer long that they were going to overthrow the government after stealing the election. They said, we're going to win by the ballot or the bullet or both. So this were the conditions and the things that were going on. The second part of their plan was a disinformation campaign, which we're quite familiar with today in our own politics, depicting black men as corrupt, as well as sexually insatiable and constantly on the prowl for white women. They created a phony rape campaign where they planted phony stories in the papers, led by the News and Observer in Raleigh, of black men supposedly raping white women and a rape epidemic. And they were trying to convince white voters that blacks were not intelligent enough to vote, and certainly not intelligent enough to hold a public office, and the ones who did were completely incompetent and corrupt. I wanted to read a quick description of the white supremacy campaign led by Josephus Daniels, who was the editor of the News and Observer, the publisher and editor. He called himself a journalist, but in fact he was a politician who happened to own the most powerful newspaper in the state, and in fact he held meetings of the Democratic Party Executive Committee in the newsroom of the News and Observer. I'll just read a short passage that described this white supremacy campaign and the propaganda arm. More than a century before sophisticated fake news attacks targeted social media websites, Daniel's manipulation of white readers through phony or misleading newspaper stories was perhaps the most daring and effective disinformation campaign of the era. The most sensational stories focused on what Daniels and other Democrats claimed was the black beast rapist. As a native of the South, Daniels understood implicitly the sexual insecurities of white Southern males. Already emasculated by Union troops who had occupied their towns, they risked further shame if black men were elevated to something approaching equality. A black man who could vote or hold public office was a man who might, by their logic, become a rival for the affections of white women. Daniels escalated trivial incidents into front-page outrages. All that was required was incidental contact between a white woman and a black man.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it was very clear, and it's interesting to realize that there was this cooperation taking place between white populists and black Republicans, and the fusion movement showed that there could have been shared interest and shared approaches. So it was a overriding goal to break that up and make certain that that union did not continue. You talking about the political conditions in the 1890s, the governor was Republican at the time as well, right? So it was this occurred at a point that Republicans had gained substantial control at the local as well as the state level. I wonder if you could talk about the events that that were prepared. You've already begun discussing them, but the events leading up to the coup, this was not just an outburst that was provoked by a single event. It was well planned, and they had a strategy. What was the thinking of the strategists, including Daniels and others, about how they should approach the 1898 election, which was a state election, not a local election, but it did include county offices. But how should they approach the election on November 8th, and then followed up with what?
Yeah. You made a very good point about this not being a spontaneous outburst of white rage, where in fact all the other so-called race riots in our history, particularly Tulsa is one example, all of these other so-called race riots there in Chicago and in New Orleans and in South Carolina were triggered by some sort of incident between a black man and a white woman. In the case of Tulsa, it was supposedly a black man in an elevator had accidentally tripped over the foot of a white woman, and this was a spontaneous outburst of white rage. The one thing that makes Wilmington unique, it's the only one of these so-called race riots, and it wasn't a race riot, it was a white supremacist coup, that was carefully planned and calculated over a period of months. And not only that, it was announced, the white supremacists, led by Josephus Daniels, announced all summer and fall that they intended to win the election by the ballot or the bullet or both. And this naturally attracted the press. All the major newspapers of the day, the New York Times, Washington Post, Philadelphia Inquirer, Chicago Tribune, and on, sent their white reporters, and of course all reporters were white men. They sent them down to Wilmington during the summer and the fall of 1898 to report on what they called the race war. And to get them on their side, the white supremacists met them at the train station and gave them cigars and whiskey and arranged for their lodging, and also arranged for what today we would call embedding. They would take the white reporters around with the red shirts, who were the militia, the terrorist militia of the white supremacy movement, and fill them with the white supremacist narrative that it was the black men, not white men, who were arming themselves and planning a so-called race riot to take over the town. They actually believed their own propaganda, and several whites made plans for when the day that this black riot was supposed to happen, on the day of the election, to take white families and hide them in churches and other public buildings to avoid this black riot that obviously never was going to happen, that was completely false. So the plan was to steal the election on November 8th of 1898, through stuffing ballot boxes and intimidating enough black men to keep them from voting, then have 2 days of, quote, watching and waiting, is the way they described it, and then on the 10th, they would rise up and take over the city government, because, as Jim mentioned, the election, it was a federal, state, and county election, but it was not a municipal election. So the municipal offices, those people, the mayor, the police chief, the city councilman, and others, would remain in office until the municipal election the next March. Well, the white supremacists weren't going to wait that long, and planned that once they stole the election on the 8th, they would then, on the 10th, rise up with their armed vigilantes, kill black men, force a coup, and take over the government, which is precisely what they did. Now, in preparation for this, it's interesting, the way they stole the election was, first of all, was intimidating and terrorizing enough black men to drive down the black vote, which they did. And secondly, they would send these red shirts into polling places, and late in the day when the votes were being counted and it was starting to get dark, it was November, they would knock over the oil lamp, create a disturbance, start a small fire, and literally stuff phony Republican ballots and remove the Democratic ballots. In a lot of precincts, there were more white supremacist Democratic votes than there were the number of voters registered in the district. So it was out and out fraud, but it was very effective. I do want to read you a speech the night before the election that was given by Colonel Waddell, who's a central figure of this book. He is a former Confederate officer who was the leader of the white supremacy campaign in Wilmington, and he gave a speech to about 1,000 red shirts and other armed men the night before the election. And here's what he told them, quote, "Men, the crisis is upon us," Waddell began. "You must do your duty. This city, county, and state shall be rid of Negro domination once and forever. You have the courage. You are brave. You are the sons of noble ancestry. You are Anglo-Saxons. You are armed and prepared, and you will do your duty. Be ready at a moment's notice. Go to the polls tomorrow, and if you find the Negro out voting, tell him to leave the polls. And if he refuses, kill him. Shoot him down in his tracks." And that's exactly what they did 2 days later. They did not kill anyone during the election because they didn't have to, because there weren't enough black men voting to make a difference. But on the 10th, they killed, estimates range all over the place, but a state riot commission report said they killed at least 60 unarmed black men in cold blood on the 10th. And we can get to that in a minute if you like, the events of the 10th.
Mm-hmm. There was one detail in that lead-up period that I didn't understand, and that was persuading the Republican governor to pull back and not try to do anything about, and in fact, to contribute to the outcome.
Daniel Russell was a Republican. Most importantly, though, he was a member of the rice and cotton gentry. His father owned slaves. He grew up on a big plantation. He was related by blood or marriage to several of the white supremacist leaders in Wilmington. They knew how to push his buttons. He's up in Raleigh. They completely intimidated him and warned that they were going to start their own riot, and he would be blamed for it if he didn't withdraw the Republican slate for county offices before the election. And he was so intimidated, he agreed to do that. So they won the county offices without a fight. They just withdrew white and black candidates. Which was just another part of the plan. Now, the day of the coup, the leaders of the coup, including the leader of the Wilmington Light Infantry, which was supposedly the National Guard, that was supposed to stamp out trouble, not cause it. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Walker Taylor. He telegraphed Governor Russell and claimed that black men were starting to riot, and he needed permission to call out the National Guard, i.e. the Wilmington Light Infantry, to put down the riot. Now, Russell knew very well what was happening in his own city, and he knew this was a complete ruse and completely false, but he was so intimidated, he gave them permission to call out not only the Wilmington Light Infantry, but the Naval Reserves, and that was 140 armed, trained soldiers with 2 machine guns that had been supplied by white merchants during the summer. The white merchants had got up money to give them the firepower to overwhelm what they predicted was going to be a black riot. And so these 2 militias were out in the streets with their rapid-fire guns, hunting down and killing black men, along with about 1,500 other white vigilantes, most of them the so-called red shirts. Others were just citizens with guns who came out to get in on the killing. Among them were ministers who actually, during the spring and summer of 1898, gave white supremacist sermons giving a Christian patina over what was going to happen that made it seem like it was a Christian duty to stamp out what they called Negro domination. So they were out in the streets as well with guns, along with white doctors, lawyers, and businessmen. I mean, it was everybody from them down to laborers and workers, mostly Irish. It was mostly Irish and Scotch immigrants who lived there. And this force rampaged through the streets, killing every black man they saw. And as I said before, at least 60 black men were murdered. And their plan was, after they killed any black man they saw, then they marched 1,500 strong, burned down the black newspaper, This alarmed all the black residents of the town. They heard the fire alarm, saw the smoke, and thought wrongly that the entire black part of town was being burned when in fact it was only the newspaper. But there were 800 black men who worked at a cotton compress, the Sprint cotton compress, the biggest cotton compress in the world at the time. Their wives ran to get them, saying that white men were coursing through the streets, killing people, burning the city down. It actually hadn't begun yet, but these black men rushed home, coalesced on a corner, trying to figure out what to do. They had virtually no weapons. They were outgunned by the white men. An argument developed. They started screaming back and forth at each other. The white men opened fire, and that's how the riot began. After the killing, late in the afternoon, these armed white men, 1,500 strong or more, marched to City Hall, forced the police chief, the mayor, and the entire city council to resign at gunpoint, and then they appointed the leaders of the coup in their places. As Colonel Waddell was appointed mayor, the other leaders of the coup became city councilmen, and then one of the main instigators of the coup was named police chief.
And as far as we know, this is the only example of a coup d'etat overthrowing a local government in the United States in its history, right?
It is. It is the only armed overthrow of an elected government in U.S. history. It hasn't happened before or since.
And so this was what was planned for 2 days after the election, and it
Correct.
happened on November 10th. Let me open it up for questions from the audience at this point about the events that we've covered so far. There'll be more to talk about, and we'll have more questions later. But any questions at this point that have been called in, or anyone here? Yes. Here comes a microphone. Going up at front row. Come on up to the front row to Carol Brest here. Yep.
There we go.
Oh, you're supposed to hold thing. Okay. Many of the men that you write about had two families, one with a white wife and the other with a black woman. I assume the black woman lived in the house and worked in the house as a servant. Did her children also live in the house? And did they play with their half-siblings? And can you explain the obsession of those same white men who had their black concubine with the possibility of a black man having sex with a white woman?
Right. Great question. Now, these conditions took place long before 1898. This was in the antebellum era leading up to the Civil War, and it was extremely common for white plantation owners, as you say, to have two families, one white and one black, and the kids did play together. One interesting example of this is a man named Alex Manley, who was the African-American editor of the black newspaper in Wilmington, which claimed at the time to be the only black daily in the world. I don't know that it was, but it was one of very few. It wasn't just a weekly, it was a daily newspaper, and he was just a courageous guy. He challenged white supremacy in print, and he himself was the grandson of a white governor, Charles Manley, who had raped Alex's grandmother, who was a slave on the plantation, and the child of that rape was Alex Manley's father. And Alex Manley, if anybody read the book, you see a picture of him, could have, quote, passed, which for a white man, which a lot of light-skinned and mixed-race black men did at the time. He refused. He said he was going to live his life as a proud black man, and this issue of this sexual intimidation, I mean, basically rape by whites against black women, was the subject of an editorial in August of 1898 that many whites later said precipitated the coup. Well, in fact, it didn't, because the coup had already been planned. But I want to read you just a segment from this editorial, which was extremely powerful. This is, again, Alex Manley in the black readership newspaper, the Daily Record. Quote, "Every Negro lynched is called a, quote, big, burly, black brute. when in fact many of those who have thus been dealt with had white men for their fathers, and were not only black and burly, but were sufficiently attractive for white girls of culture and refinement to fall in love with them, as is very well known to all. Let virtue be something more than an excuse for them to intimidate and torture a helpless people. And he's addressing the whites here. Tell your men that it is no worse for a black man to be intimate with a white woman than for a white man to be intimate with a colored woman. You set yourselves down as a lot of carping hypocrites, in that you cry aloud for the virtue of your women while you seek to destroy the morality of ours. Now you can imagine this did not go over well with the white supremacists who ran, or who were trying to get their power back in Wilmington. I mean, he made two important points. One, that black men who were lynched for supposedly raping white women were in fact in many cases their consensual lovers. And secondly, that for generations, white men had been raping black women with impunity. Now, after this editorial ran on August 18th in 1898, the red shirts wanted to lynch Alex Manly that day. And to show you just how calculated this coup was, the leaders of the coup said, no, it's too early. We can make political hay out of this. We can use this to our advantage closer to the election in November. So let's wait. Let's use this editorial to inflame poor white voters and get them back into our party. And in fact, white newspapers across the state and across the South reprinted Manly's editorial to incite whites to go out and basically attack blacks and keep them from voting. And it worked very well, particularly in North Carolina and in Wilmington. Whites were furious at this editorial. The white leaders also told the red shirts who wanted to lynch Manly that closer to the election, when the coup was planned, that they could burn the newspaper down and they could lynch Manly. They would let them do it. Well, in fact, Manly, and just before the election, was warned by a white man, a white friend, that he was about to be lynched, and he gave Manly $25 in gold coins and the password to get through the white checkpoints, and he managed to flee from town just before the coup, and he made it up to a new life in Philadelphia.
Okay, all right. Any other questions about these events at this point? Let me just, so the Republicans took over the state legislature in that election, and it was, as well as taking over Wilmington government. One of the consequences was forcing black leaders, businessmen, professionals, to leave town, right? What was the extent of that?
Yeah, this was called the banishment campaign, and again, it was well conceived, well thought out. Before the coup, the white supremacists came up with a list of black and white leaders who were considered troublemakers. They managed to kill a lot of the black leaders, the most powerful men, but they didn't get them all, and the rest were on a list. And they sent out the militia to round them up, put them in jail for the night, and the next day they marched them to the train station. At the same time, they had a list of white Republicans, so-called race traitors, who in some ways they held in more contempt than black men because these were men who had betrayed their own race in their eyes. They were carpetbaggers and scalawags, and there were a list of these men, the mayor and the police chief were among them. The militia went out and rounded up these men who were almost killed and lynched on the way to the train station by white mobs. They were so angry at them, but they managed to get them on the trains, and they told both the black leaders and the white leaders who they marched to the train station, they said, if you ever come back to Wilmington again, we'll kill you on sight. And not one of them ever came back, not a single one of them ever came back to Wilmington, and including Alex Manly, who never came back either.
So that was an immediate impact.
Yeah, this was the day after the riot.
In terms of what happened after that, how did then things change in North Carolina, and how did the climate change, the legal rights to vote, and so on change?
Basically, the coup ushered in Jim Crow in North Carolina. The first Jim Crow law in the state was passed, and shortly after that, in 1898 or 99, it required segregation in separate sections on trolley cars. in Wilmington. And from then on, Jim Crow laws just poured out of the state legislature because the Democrats had taken over the legislature. And just to show you how effective they were in keeping black men from voting, in 1896, 2 years before the coup, there were 126,000 black men registered to vote in North Carolina, 126,000. By 1902, 4 years after the coup, the number was down to 6,000. And after 1898, black men and later black women did not vote in any significant number for the next 70 years until after passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. They essentially did not vote because of Jim Crow laws, literacy tests, poll taxes, violence and intimidation, lynching by the Klan. They did not vote at all. As far as political office, there was a man named White, George Henry White, in 1898 was the single only black man in Congress, in the House or the Senate. And he was from North Carolina, from a district next to Wilmington. Josephus Daniels and the other white newspapers hounded him out of the state. They printed vicious lies and slander against him and his wife and his family. He announced in a rueful interview with the New York Times that he was not going to run for re-election, and in fact, he was going to leave North Carolina, and pardon my language, but he said, "God damn North Carolina, the state of my birth. I cannot live in North Carolina and be treated like a man." After that, no black American from North Carolina served in the Senate or the House for almost 100 years until 1992. There was not a single African American in Congress from North Carolina for all that period. On the Wilmington City Council, there wasn't, after the 3 black aldermen were forced from office that day in 1898, no black person served on the Wilmington Council until 1972. This is almost 3/4 of a century later. So you can just see how amazingly effective this coup was up through, actually, the beginning of the civil rights era in the 50s and the 60s. Things didn't begin to change in Wilmington or in North Carolina until then.
And of course, voting restrictions were put in place, but then, whites weren't all that well educated. How did they get to vote?
This was really interesting. Josephus Daniels came up with something called the grandfather clause. And this had been perfected in Louisiana, and Daniels and the rest of the white supremacists, again, who now controlled the state legislature, seized on this. The grandfather clause was ingenious, and in fact, the Democratic Party paid for Josephus Daniels to take a tour of Louisiana to convince white voters in North Carolina what a wonderful thing the grandfather clause was. And he went there pretending to be an objective journalist, but in fact it was a propaganda campaign paid for by the Democratic Party. He didn't want to pay his own expenses, so the Democratic Party paid a supposed newspaper reporter to go down and report. And of course, he wrote all these glowing stories on how effective it was in keeping black people from voting, and he celebrated it. Because the Democrats now controlled the state legislature, they passed the so-called grandfather clause modeled on the Louisiana law. And it basically said that any voter whose ancestors voted before 1868, which conveniently enough was the year that black people got the vote, were not subject to the poll tax or the literacy test. And you have to remember at this time, 25% of white men in North Carolina were illiterate, and a lot of white voters were poor. So the poll tax and the literacy test really affected them. But the grandfather clause effectively eliminated them from having to take that, because all of them could prove that their ancestors voted before 1868. On the other hand, no black man could prove that his ancestor voted before 1868 because black men didn't have the vote. The only exception was so-called mulattoes like Alex Manly. If you had proof, you could show that your white grandfather voted, but it was hardly a factor. So that was how they protected poor, illiterate white voters, at the same time almost 100% preventing black men from voting. And that law went into effect in 1900. And there were several other states that followed suit afterwards, I think 4 or 5 other states. The Supreme Court struck down grandfather clauses in 1915, but by that time, Jim Crow laws and intimidation and the KKK and all of this was enough to keep black men from voting, and they really didn't need the grandfather clause anymore.
Okay. What were the long-term consequences for Wilmington?
Well, Wilmington in 1898, as I said, was 56% black. Today it's 18% black. The black middle class was destroyed and has never recovered. The black professional class was destroyed and has never recovered. Black people fled by the thousands in the days and weeks after the coup. There were 2,100 African Americans fled just in those few weeks, and over time, Wilmington, rightfully so, got a reputation among African Americans, a place you do not want to be. So black life in Wilmington was crushed. I mean, to this very day, black professionals who get recruited to come work in Wilmington, many of them, and I've talked to them, say that they don't want to live there because of the history of what happened in Wilmington. And the privileges that accrued to the descendants of the whites, and of course the lack of opportunity to the African Americans who remained behind. And we can talk about this later if you want. In 1998, all these issues came to a boil during the centennial of the coup, and we can talk about that later if anybody has a question about it.
Well, what is Wilmington's Law? You've touched on this at many points along the way, but what's the significance of that in the title?
This incident, in the immediate years after 1898, the white perpetrators of the coup were very proud of what they'd done, and they wrote books and memoirs and letters. They celebrated it. They were very open about it. And in fact, Josephus Daniels organized an enormous parade and celebration in Raleigh right afterwards, invited whites from around the state, gave them free tickets on the trains to come. Thousands of people burned torches and celebrated the end of so-called Negro domination and Negro rule. So they were very open about it. But after that generation passed on, the story was buried, and the only thing that was discussed was that it was a black riot, and that unfortunately the good Christian educated white men of Wilmington had or were forced to put down this black riot, and unfortunately they had to use force, but they had no other choice because, as I said before, they portrayed the black men in office as corrupt and incompetent, portrayed black men as not intelligent enough to vote or hold office, and that was the lie that was perpetuated for nearly a century, that this was a black race riot. I do want to read you from textbooks in North Carolina schools. This, I was shocked by. This was one of the most amazing things I've read in my life. I went through and looked at some of the high school textbooks that described what happened in Wilmington. I'll read you a few excerpts from, these are actually state textbooks that were taught to high school students, white high school students at the time. Here's something from a 1933 state high school textbook. Quote, "There were many Negro office holders in the eastern part of the state, some of whom were poorly fitted for their tasks. This naturally aroused ill feelings between the races," close quote. Now here's a 1940 textbook. Quote, "The mass of Negroes became poor citizens. To keep their vote, the carpetbaggers and scalawags allowed them to do very much as they pleased. The worst crimes were not punished. The white people of the South were no longer safe." Here's from a 1949 textbook. They boiled the entire coup down to one sentence. "A number of blacks were jailed for starting a riot, and a new white administration took over Wilmington's government." Now finally, here's from a 1940 textbook which described why the KKK and the red shirts were necessary, and specifically focusing on the coup. Quote, "To put an end to this terrible condition, white people all over the South joined together in a sort of club which they named the Ku Klux Klan. Members of the Ku Klux Klan, dressed as ghosts, scared lawless men into acting decently. On moonlit nights, these men could be seen on horseback, riding to bring order back into the lives of their people. Such sights frightened the Negroes into living better lives. The names of those men, Negro or white, who had done wrong were listed. The next moonlit night, the Ku Klux Klan would visit these men and punish them according to the wrongs they had done. After this, lawless men were not so bold, and crime became less and less.
Amazing.
So that's the lie in Wilmington's lie.
Okay. Well, let me invite questions again. The microphone will come to you. Virgil, are you ready for Lynn? Or here we go. Here it comes.
I'd like to ask an opinion, maybe. In our situation today, with all this discussion about what you just talked about, these books being how they were written, and this issue around critical race theory trying to be prohibited from the textbooks of many, many states, do you think that the white supremacy movement, because the diversity in our country is increasing, and it would seem logical that the white supremacists are going to feel more threatened, do you think that that our democracy is safer today than it was 50 years, 80 years, 100 years ago?
Not at all. There's a term that white supremacists today and Donald Trump and his followers use. It's called replacement theory. You've probably heard of it. Is that good, God-fearing white men and women who are the people who founded this country and the people who should be running this country are being threatened by people of color who are not qualified. This is their message, not in so many words, but this is what comes through, are not qualified, and are the other. These are the people threatening your way of life. And we saw this on January 6th in the worst storming of the Capitol since the War of 1812. And in fact, in 1898, the white supremacists didn't use the term replacement theory, but that's exactly what was motivating them. They feared that their way of life, the white supremacist way of life that had existed for generations, was under threat. If black men were given the vote, it would basically ruin their way of life. And I really think today, obviously, white supremacists aren't as openly and nakedly racist and as violent as they were in 1898, but they're still a tremendous threat. And what I realized in researching this book and with the election of Donald Trump is that there has been this layer of white supremacy, of anger and resentment that's been there all these years. And this is a large proportion of our population. It's been there all along, but Donald Trump ignited it. He's a very skillful demagogue. He knows how to play on people's fears and emotions. And his message is, your way of life is under threat. And his not so subtle message is, this is his embracement of the white evangelical movement, that America is a white Christian country and it's under threat. You saw when he lost the election and he came up with the false narrative that the election was stolen from them. Well, in 1897, when the black men were elected to the city council and appointed to jobs as magistrates and other positions in city government, the white supremacists said the election was stolen and they demanded a recount. Well, here we have 120 some years later, whites who lost the election demanding a recount, saying the election was stolen. So in answer to your question, I'm sorry to be so long-winded, but I do feel that democracy is very much under threat with these voter suppression laws that are being passed around the country that give state legislatures the power, if you read the laws carefully, to overturn the electoral slate of any state that happened to vote Democratic. They could just flip it back, which is what Trump was trying to do in Georgia when he called the Secretary of State and asked him to find those votes, which he tried to do in Pennsylvania and Arizona. So I see a real threat to this. I am not saying all the Trump supporters are white supremacists by any means, but there is that layer there, very much who are believers in white supremacy. You saw the Confederate flags at the January 6th event. So I really think a lot of that is playing on that fear, on that resentment of people of other colors and other ethnic groups coming to steal their nation. You heard it when Donald Trump came down that escalator in 2015 to announce his candidacy. He said Mexican rapists, and he used that term, were coming across the border to steal your jobs and kill women and children. The white supremacists of 1898 had the same message about black rapists coming to take your job. I didn't mention earlier, but economics was a big part of this coup. Whites, working class and poor whites, feared that black men were stealing their jobs. So we see the echoes of 1898 over and over again today.
Did you write? Here's, okay, go ahead there, and then.
Maurice Ritchie, I really want to thank you for a fantastic book. I enjoyed reading it very much, and I was so impressed with the way you could share so much detail without devouring your overall narrative. It really keeps moving nicely. But one part that I really did appreciate was the effort you made to discover how some of the blacks planned their life for that day, the day of the coup, and the 8th and the 10th, and how they negotiated exit from the city, and then how they got out of the city and got farther north, and what happened to them there. And I think the group might really appreciate hearing some comment about one or two of those lives, if you care to share that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the real irony of this is a lot of the black men who survived and were put on the trains and run out of town as part of the banishment campaign went on to very successful lives in other cities. Alex Manly, for one, went to Philadelphia, and he started something called the Armstrong Association, which was designed to help poor young black men coming up from the South and teaching them industrial skills for blue-collar jobs, and that later became the Urban League. So he had a very successful career. A man named William Henderson, who was the leading black lawyer in Wilmington, red shirts surrounded and attacked his house the night of the coup and gave him 24 hours to get out of town. He went on to a very successful career as a civil rights attorney in Indianapolis. And finally, Armand Scott, who was 26 at the time, and he was the youngest and most fit of the black leaders, which we didn't talk about earlier, but the night before the coup, they were called together by Colonel Waddell. They were grouped as the Committee of Concerned Colored Citizens, handpicked by the whites as the leaders of the black community, and they were read the riot act literally by Colonel Waddell the night before the riot and before the coup, and were told that if they didn't get Alex Manly out of town, there would be a coup and there would be violence. And in fact, Alex Manly had already left. But Armand Scott was the man chosen to deliver the response of this committee to Colonel Waddell, because he gave him a deadline of 7:30 the next morning. But as Armand Scott, this young lawyer, tried to walk to deliver the answer, which was on a piece of paper, to Colonel Waddell's house, he saw the red shirts running through the streets firing Winchesters. He was terrified. He put it in the mail, went to the post office and put it in the mail. Of course, it didn't arrive in time the next morning. Colonel Waddell already knew what had happened. He knew their answer, but he used that as a pretext to march on the paper and burn it down and start the riot. But Armand Scott went on to become the first black lawyer to be named on the Washington, I believe it was the city courts in Washington, became a very well-known figure. He was appointed by Franklin Roosevelt. And he remarked in his memoirs that if he hadn't been run out of Wilmington, he would have remained a cornfield lawyer. So in a way, it was the best thing that ever happened to him. And he thrived, as did a lot of other people. So anyway, thanks for that question.
Okay. Carol?
Oh, can I hold it? No. The preachers come off very poorly in your book. They're vicious racists. My question is, were there preachers who were not vicious racists, and maybe some of them just have to go north because they were not acceptable?
If there were, they kept awful quiet about it. They certainly didn't stand up in defense of African Americans. The only one who did was a Catholic priest who rode out during the killing with James Sprunt, who owned the Sprunt Cotton Compress, who wanted to save his workers from being murdered. But this minister went out to try to save lives and to try to get the militiamen and the rioters to stop killing and to try to install some sense of shame or guilt into them. So that was the only example I found of a clergyman actually having the courage to stand up and confront the rioters. There may have been others who were sympathetic to African Americans, but they certainly didn't raise their heads up. And I cite several examples in the book of other ministers preaching hate from the pulpit and walking around with Winchesters the day of the coup.
Here's a hand here.
You told us how the old textbooks write up the events. What is it like in the current textbooks?
I wish I could tell you, because that is a huge issue now. As you know, the Republicans in the state legislature are trying to ban, quote, critical race theory, and they're trying to ban any teaching of America as a country with any kind of a racist history. From my point of view, I'm biased, I think they're trying to literally whitewash history. So that's an issue right now, and I've given a lot of book talks around North Carolina, and a lot of public school teachers have come up to me and said that Wilmington 1898 is not on the curriculum, but they are teaching it anyway because they think it's important enough. They're not waiting for permission from the school board. They're just doing it on their own. And I forget the name of the teachers group, but they are pushing right now to have it required teaching in the schools. But now they're coming head to head against this Republican initiative that would outlaw teaching of events like this. So I can't answer your question. But there's nothing I've looked at current textbooks, there's maybe 2 or 3 lines, and most of the ones I've seen, basically saying there was a race riot and whites took over the government. I mean, very essential, doesn't go into any context or depth that I could tell.
Any other questions? Oh, here's one here, and I think it probably will have to be the wrap-up question. Go over here, the hand on the side, on the other side.
We're ever so grateful for you bringing the truth tonight. We have an anti-racism group here that has been studying things like this for almost a year and uncovering a whole lot of other lies that we were never taught. We all believed that if we had a bad president that the legislature would get him in tow, and if the legislature went sour that the Supreme Court would preserve democracy, and if none of the 3 of those wanted to preserve democracy, that at least the media could be counted on to tell us the truth. How are we to find hope now for somebody to tell the truth and make the truth abide?
Well, it's very difficult when you have the President of the United States saying the news media is the enemy of the people. And he's been very, very successful in turning people against the news media. I mean, we are by no means perfect, but the framers of the Constitution realized the importance of a free press and holding government responsible. Donald Trump and the Republican Party believe just the opposite. And in closing here, just to show you how relevant what happened in 1898 is today, I just want to read you about the voter ID law. Do you have a second?
Sure.
And voter suppression. And one thing I just found out recently, I was shocked. The Republican delegation in the State House and the Senate is 100% white. I didn't know that. Almost all white men. I mean, there are some women, but I was shocked to discover that. That's just like a little trivia that I came across related to this. But I'm talking here about the voter ID bill. In 2012, voters elected a Republican governor in North Carolina. From that power base, white legislators reprised a tactic perfected by their forebears in 1898, suppressing the black vote. They began searching for ways to restrict voting among groups that traditionally voted Democratic, especially African Americans who had abandoned the Republican Party during the Civil Rights era. Republicans spent months unearthing obscure statistics on black voting patterns, searching for vulnerabilities. They inundated the state election board with data requests. How many black voters lacked a driver's license? How many took advantage of early voting hours? How many voted during early voting hours on Sunday? The legislators proposed a voter ID law that included a set of restrictions aimed at black voters. But they were thwarted by the Voting Rights Act, which targeted states like North Carolina with a history of racial discrimination in voting. The law required 40 of North Carolina's 100 counties to seek federal pre-clearance for any changes to voting procedures. But in 2013, the United States Supreme Court in Shelby County versus Holder gutted the law and eliminated the pre-clearance requirement. Within hours of the Shelby decision, a Republican leader of the voter ID effort in North Carolina told reporters, now we can go ahead with the full bill for voter ID because the legal headache of pre-clearance has been removed. The state's conservatives were now free to invoke the spirit of 1898 via a 21st century voter suppression law, nearly as effective as the suffrage amendments and grandfather clause 115 years earlier. The so-called voter ID bill was passed into law in 2013. It reduced early voting and Sunday, quote, souls to the poll voting, both used disproportionately by African Americans. It eliminated same-day registration and straight ticket voting, two other provisions especially popular among African Americans. The new law also required a state-issued ID to vote. That requirement imposed a special burden on African American voters, many of whom lacked a driver's license, birth certificate, or other official documents required to obtain a state-issued ID. In 1898, suppression of black voting rights went unchallenged, but more than a century later, the U.S. Justice Department and civil rights groups sued to block voter ID in North Carolina. In July 2016, a three-judge federal appeals court struck down the voter ID law, ruling that its provisions, quote, target African Americans with almost surgical precision, close quote. The panel added, quote, because of race, the legislature enacted one of the largest restrictions on the franchise in modern North Carolina history, close quote. The court pointed out that Republican politicians had crafted the law after collecting data showing that African Americans would be disproportionately burdened by its requirements. The judges emphasized, quote, the inextricable link between race and politics in North Carolina, close quote. They also said that voter ID restrictions, quote, impose cures for problems that did not exist, close quote. I won't read you the whole part about gerrymandering, but in 1898, or prior to 1898, the white supremacists in Wilmington realized that they were overwhelmed by the 56% black majority, so they took all the black voters and stuffed them into two precincts to dilute their voting power to make sure all the other precincts had white supremacist majorities. In 2011, starting in 2011 and 12, Republicans in the state legislature here once again used gerrymandering to squeeze black voters for congressional districts into two serpentine districts. They had to do it like this to squeeze them all in and then make all the other districts safe for white Republicans. In February 2016, a federal three-judge panel ruled that the two majority black congressional districts had been racially gerrymandered in violation of the 14th Amendment. The panel found that, quote, race was the legislature's paramount concern, close quote. In August 2016, a different three-judge panel ruled that 28 of North Carolina's gerrymandered state house and state districts, also state house and Senate districts, also were racial gerrymanders that violated the 14th Amendment. The ruling said Republican legislatures had created the districts, quote, through the predominant and unjustified use of race, close quote. In both cases, the state legislature was ordered to redraw the districts. And we're still fighting that fight today because every time they redraw them, there's a lawsuit, they get thrown out, and they rewrite them again. So the gerrymandering is still very much alive.
David, thank you so much for sharing
Thank
this
you.
evening with us. We didn't notice any jet lag, by the way.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It was great to be here.
And I just want to say, as was indicated in your remarks, one of the wonderful things about this book is that you learn about individuals, the lives, the challenge, their lives, the challenges they face. So if you haven't seen the book yet, we recommend it. Thank you so much for coming,
Thank
and
you,
all
Jim.
of you for coming out for
Thanks,
this
everybody.
session.